I'd like to particularly thank NAB for your sponsorship over the past 7 years. Your support has been critical to the Foundation's work, and it's greatly supported, and it's actually making a material difference. So thank you to NAB. As David said, this is my 7th and final time that I've had the honour of addressing the annual lunch of the Unika Foundation. My 43 years at the RBA and my 7 years as Governor come to a close next week, hence the title of my remarks today, Some Closing Remarks. The government announced my appointment as Governor of the RBA on the 5th of May 2016. It turned out to be the most challenging day of my life, not because of the trepidation I felt about taking on the job, which was considerable, but because of a medical emergency. I was in Ottawa, Canada at the time. I had just spoken at a conference organised by the Bank of Canada and had been congratulated on my appointment. As I left the stage, I felt very tired from what I thought was overwhelming jet lag. But the next thing I recall, I was in a room with bright lights, strapped to a bed, and was wearing just a flimsy gown. As I was trying to make sense of where I was, I thought about something that I'd previously read on the internet, and that was that there was this secret society of central bank governors and that it had some bizarre initiation ceremonies. And I recall thinking for a moment, maybe it's true here in Canada. But I was wrong. And Michelle, I can assure you there's no such secret society of central bank governors, and there are certainly not bizarre initiation ceremonies. Instead, the Canadians were into world-class healthcare. Unbeknown to me, the carotid artery in my neck had split, probably because of the way I'd slept on the plane, so be careful. The split in the artery had led to a blood clot which had potentially fatal consequences, but due to the fast action of the Bank of Canada staff and the excellent care at Ottawa Hospital, they got on top of the situation quickly, and 7 years later, I'm here finishing my term reasonably fit and healthy. I recount this story because it reinforced two lessons that have influenced very strongly how I've gone about my job. The first lesson is that uncertainty is a fact of life, and we all need to manage it. None of us has a crystal ball, and the unexpected happens, and we need to adjust. The second lesson is that there's a lot to be grateful for, that indeed the glass is half full. I've had the great privilege of working with a group of very talented people at the RBA who are strongly committed to serving the public interest. I've had the great privilege of being the Governor of a widely respected central bank in a country that enjoys one of the highest standards of living in the world. It's been a challenging job, but it's been an immensely rewarding one. Over my 7 years as Governor, I've faced three main economic challenges. The first was a protracted period of inflation below target. The second was the global pandemic. And the third was the highest inflation rate in more than 30 years. None of those events were widely predicted, they were all unexpected, and none were unique to Australia. Notwithstanding these events, underlying inflation over my term has averaged 2.7%. In headline terms, it's averaged 3%. These numbers are above the midpoint of the 2 to 3% target range, but they are within that range, and inflation expectations today remain well anchored. Even so, inflation's been more variable over my term as Governor than it was in the previous 2 decades. Inflation's varied from a low of -0.3 to a high, as you know, of 7.8. That's quite a lot of variation and much more than the last 2 decades. My view is that it will be difficult to return to the world in which inflation tracked in a very narrow range. The increased prevalence of supply shocks, deglobalisation, climate change, the energy transition and shifts in demographics mean either steeper supply curves or more variable supply curves. Now, this doesn't mean that on average inflation can't equal the target, but I think it does mean that inflation is going to be more variable than it was for the last 20 years, and we all need to adjust to that. In terms of the labour market, When I became the Governor in 2016, the unemployment rate was in the 5.5% to 6% range. As you know, over the past year, it's been around 3.5%. That's the lowest rate in nearly 50 years, and the share of Australians with a job today has never been higher. And the number of people with a job has increased by more than 2 million since mid-2016. Because the current cycle still has some way to run, but it's certainly possible that Australia now can sustain an unemployment rate below the rate we've had for the last 40 years. If we can do that, and I think we can, that's very good news for the economy and for our society. It's good news for children in particular, because they can now get jobs, and the youth unemployment rate today is the lowest it's been in 30 years. So this is good news. Notwithstanding these outcomes, the issue that has defined my term as Governor more than any other is the forward guidance about interest rates that was provided during the pandemic. That guidance was widely interpreted as a commitment rather than a conditional statement that interest rates would not increase until 2024. As you know, interest rates started increasing in May 2022, and there's been much criticism of me and of the Reserve Bank since then, especially by those who borrowed during the pandemic based on our guidance. Now, there's a lot to be learned from this experience, including how to communicate in uncertain times. But I ask that people keep in mind the circumstances that we faced in 2020. And it was a really scary time. An unknown virus was sweeping the world. Our international borders were closed. People couldn't move across state lines. We were being told to stay in our homes. Temporary morgues were being set up around this and other cities. And a vaccine was thought to be years away. It was a scary time. There were credible projections that the unemployment rate would rise to 15% and that there would be a deep and scarring economic contraction. As I said, it was a scary time. And even well into 2021, large parts of the country were still in very stringent lockdowns. The government and the RBA responded forcefully to these developments. At the RBA, we wanted to build a bridge to better times and to provide some insurance against the very worst outcomes. And I know that the government had a very similar mindset. In the end, this approach worked. The Australian economy avoided falling into the abyss, and then it bounced back pretty well. With the benefit of hindsight, my view is that we did do too much. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. None of us can predict the future, and we had to make decisions under great uncertainty and with incomplete information. We got some things right, but we got other things wrong. I can assure you, though, that the staff of the RBA and the members of the RBA board have been relentless in their pursuit of doing the right thing and supporting the economic prosperity of the people of Australia. So I'll leave the RBA after 43 years proud of our contribution to the stability of the Australian economy and our financial system. As I've said a number of times, I didn't have a crystal ball. In the absence of a crystal ball, I've found it helpful over the years to return to some fixed points. And I'd like to return to 4 of these fixed points today. The first is the importance of strong, credible frameworks for economic policy. For monetary policy, this means a strong nominal anchor in the form of a medium-term inflation target. And for fiscal policy, it means a credible fiscal framework that deals with the medium-term and the intertemporal budget constraint. Since the early 1990s, Australia has been very well served by a flexible inflation target centred on the 2 to 3% range. This target has successfully anchored inflation expectations, and it's provided the organising framework for monetary policy decisions. I think we've really seen the benefits of this over the past year or so. I think without this strong nominal anchor, we would have faced a much more challenging environment when inflation spiked higher. At one point during my term, when inflation was low, there were calls to lower the target. And recently, some have called for a higher target, hoping to avoid the cost of disinflation. I've consistently argued against such calls. It wouldn't be much of a nominal anchor, would it, if the inflation target was moved just because the tide was running one way for a while? People would rightly wonder what would happen when the tide inevitably ran the other way. Having chosen a target, it's best to keep with it unless there's a compelling case for change, which there is not. For fiscal policy, an anchor is also important. Governments face many demands on their budgets, and when they borrow today, they need to be able to service that debt into the future. Some countries have not dealt very well with this intertemporal aspect of fiscal policy, and public debt levels keep rising. My view is this is storing up problems for the future. Australia has done better on this front, but we are not immune to the pressures on the public purse, and those pressures are growing. And given this, a strong commitment to a fiscal framework that address the intertemporal budget constraint would help, and I think it's important. A credible medium-term framework is also useful in the area of infrastructure investment. Australia's growing population means we need to keep investing in public assets. Some years ago, I spoke about my concerns that we weren't doing enough in this area, partly due to government concerns about taking on debt. More recently, my concern has been that we're doing too much in too short a time. A well-established framework based on rigorous, independent cost-benefit analysis would help the country plan and sequence public investment. It would also lower risk premiums on private sector investments, and it would give the public confidence that our money was being spent wisely. A second fixed point that I've returned to is that we're likely to get better outcomes if monetary policy and fiscal policy are well aligned. My view has long been that if we were designing optimal policy arrangements from scratch, monetary and fiscal policy would both have a role in managing the economic cycle and inflation, and that there would be close coordination. The current global consensus, though, is that monetary policy is the main cyclical policy instrument, and it should be assigned the job of managing inflation. This is partly because monetary policy is more nimble, and it's also not influenced by political considerations. Raising interest rates and tightening policy can make you very unpopular, as I know personally all too well. This means that it's easier for an independent central bank to do this than it is for the politicians to do it. I think this assignment of responsibility makes sense, and it's worked reasonably well. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't aspire to something better. Monetary policy is a powerful instrument, but it does have its limitations, and its effects are felt very unevenly across the community, which I'm constantly reminded of. In principle, fiscal policy could provide a stronger helping hand, although this would require some rethinking of the existing policy architecture. In particular, it would require making some fiscal instruments more nimble. It would also require strengthening the automatic stabilisers and giving an independent body some limited control over some fiscal instruments. Moving in this direction is not straightforward, but my view is that some innovative thinking could help us get to a better place than where we are now. During my term, there have been times when monetary and fiscal policy worked very closely together, and at other times it would be an exaggeration to say that was the case. The coordination was most effective during the pandemic. During that period, fiscal policy was nimble, and the political constraints on its use for stabilisation purposes faded away. And we saw just how powerful it can be when the government and the RBA work closely together on fiscal and monetary policy. My own view again is that there are broader lessons here, and I was disappointed that the recent RBA review did not explore these lessons in more depth. A third fixed point that I've returned to is the importance of lifting productivity growth. I keep coming back to this issue because productivity growth is central to our future prosperity. It means rising living standards, higher real wages, a lift in our collective wealth, a bigger pie to help finance the public services that the community values, and it means less inflation pressure. Productivity growth makes most things easier. Unfortunately, the recent productivity record isn't very encouraging. We saw again yesterday in the national accounts, productivity declining. There have been many investigations into the underlying causes and what to do about it. So there's no shortage of ideas, including in the areas of tax, human capital accumulation, energy and infrastructure, the way our cities are designed, the approach to regulation and competition policy, industrial relations, and the way government services are delivered. There are improvement opportunities in every single one of these areas. So the problem is not a lack of ideas. Instead, it is building the consensus within our society to implement some of these ideas. And this is at heart fundamentally a political problem. My view is it's a major problem. If we can't build a consensus for change, the economy will drift, and there is a material risk that our living standards will stagnate. So it's an important issue to be addressed. A related theme is the link between wages, inflation and productivity growth. For inflation to average 2.5% over time, we would expect that on average, wages would increase at 2.5% plus the rate of productivity growth. Given that the distribution of national income between wages and profits can shift over time, this is not a hard and fast rule, but it's a reasonable benchmark that I've spoken about a number of times, and I think it remains a good benchmark. Early in my term, I drew attention to the low rate of wages growth, something that I saw as a problem. Wages growth of around 2% was contributing to inflation below target, and there was a concern that workers were not getting their share of the benefits of productivity growth. At the time, I spoke about a diminished sense of shared prosperity in our society and the dangers that this posed to both the community and the economy. We're obviously now in a different situation. Wages growth has picked up, which is positive. My recent focus has been that this period of high inflation could lead to wages growth and profits running ahead of the rate at which was consistent with inflation returning to target. While recent data provides some comfort on this front, we need to remain alert to this risk, for if it were to materialise, inflation would become sticky, which would require even tighter monetary policy and more economic pain later on. A lift in productivity growth will certainly be helpful here, allowing for stronger growth in nominal and real wages and stronger growth in profits. So there's a lot rides on lifting productivity growth. The fourth fixed point that I've returned to is the link between monetary policy, credit growth and asset prices. There are two issues that I want to highlight here. The first is that monetary policy can't ignore credit growth and asset prices. It's worth recalling that prior to the pandemic, economic cycles were increasingly being driven by developments on the financial side of the economy, by swings in credit and swings in asset prices. My view has long been that central banks shouldn't target credit growth, and they certainly shouldn't target asset prices, but neither can they ignore them. Interest rates directly influence how much people borrow, and it directly influences the value of assets. This means that central banks can't wash their hands of what's happening on the financial side, and we need to work closely with the prudential authorities to contain the build-up of financial and macroeconomic risks. Prior to becoming the Governor, I wrote papers on the dangers of lowering interest rates when the economy was growing well and asset prices were surging but inflation was too low. I was concerned that the desire to get inflation just up a bit with lower interest rates would encourage even more borrowing and even higher asset prices, increasing the risk of financial instability later on. I wrote about the importance of having a medium-term focus and the benefits of policies other than monetary policy, providing a helping hand, ensuring the inflation was consistent with the target. Today, we're obviously in a different situation. We don't face the problem of inflation being too low, it's too high. But looking forward, we could once again find ourselves in that situation some years down the track. This means that it's still important to think through the right policy response to the situation whereas inflation is low, but asset prices are surging and credit growth is very strong, including how fiscal and prudential policies could help address that situation. as I'm all too aware there are limits to what monetary policy can do alone. The second point in this area that I wanted to raise is that interest rates influence housing prices, but they are not the reason that Australia has some of the highest cost of housing in the world. It's certainly the case that the structurally lower nominal interest rates that followed the return of low inflation in the early 1990s contributed to an increase in housing prices relative to income. But the reason that Australia has some of the highest housing prices in the world isn't interest rates, which have been roughly at similar levels in other countries with quite different levels of housing prices. Rather, the high housing prices are the outcomes of the choices that we've all made together as a society. Choices about where we live, how we design our cities, and how we design and regulate urban land, how we invest in and design transport systems, and how we tax land and how we tax housing investment. In each of these areas, our society and our politicians have made choices that lead to high urban land and high urban housing costs. It's by tackling these issues that we can address the high cost of housing in Australia, which personally I view as a serious economic and social problem. In summary then, in the absence of crystal ball, these are the 4 fixed points that I've returned to over and over in my term of governor. Those points are the importance of strong, credible frameworks for economic policy, the benefits of monetary and fiscal policy coordination, the necessity of lifting productivity growth, and the need for central banks to pay attention to developments in asset markets and credit markets. In addition to these points, there are many other points that have been attributed to me, including a promise that interest rates would not go up until 2024. Everybody needs to get a flatmate. Everybody needs to work more hours to make ends meet, and young adults should stay at home because of the rental crisis. Yet I did not make any of those points. And I might also add that I did not choose Justin Timberlake's Can't Stop the Feeling to accompany me as I walked to a speaking podium earlier in the year. My experience here highlights the difficulties of communicating in the social media and digital age. Despite these difficulties, I have always felt the responsibility to explain complex ideas and the trade-offs and the uncertainties that we face. And I know that some of my explanations have missed the mark. But the media has a responsibility here too. In my view, is that we'll get better outcomes if the public square is filled with facts and with nuanced and informed debate, rather than vitriol, personal attacks and clickbait. As a society, we've got work to do here. I'd like to close now by wishing Michelle and her team all the best. When Glenn Stevens, who's sitting next to Michelle, was completing his term as governor, he presented me with a gift, which I brought along today. And his gift was the glass half full, or Glenn, strictly speaking, a coffee mug half full. Glenn, with your permission, I would like to re-gift this to the next governor. Michelle, I do so in the hope that as you navigate the uncertainties ahead, you remember that the glass is indeed half full and that we have a lot to be fortunate about here in Australia. Congratulations, and I would like to re-gift this to you. So finally, Thank you so much. So Glenn, your coffee cup lives on, and I was hugely delighted to be able to pass that on to Michelle. So again, thank you for your attendance today and the support of the Unika Foundation. and I look forward to answering your questions for one final time. Thank you.